In the name of God, hello everybody. This is session 10 of your syntax lesson. In this session, I want to talk about the anaphoric relations and overt NPs. Okay, in this session, I want to talk about the position of NPs and some relations like these anaphoric relations in NPs. First of all, as I told you in this chapter, we turn to some aspects of the interpretation of noun phrases, I mean NPs. The module of the grammar regulating NP interpretation will be referred to as the binding theory. Okay, we call the theory which related to the interpretation of noun phrases, we call it binding theory. The reader will be now see why the particular theory we are presenting here is often referred to as government and binding theory. The binding theory is the module of the grammar that will be responsible for assigning an appropriate interpretation to the italicized NPs in sentences like the following. For example, look at these examples. 1a, Poirot admires him. You see here we have two kind of NPs, a particular NP and the pronoun him. The second one, Bertie hurt himself. Again, you see here we have two kinds of NP, the special or proper noun Bertie and the reflexive pronoun himself. Okay, the third one, Bertie said that he felt rather ill. Again, you see here two kinds of nouns, NPs. The proper noun Bertie and the pronoun he. 1D, you look at this example. Bertie expected him to feel a little better. Again, you see two kinds of NP here. The other one, he expected Bertie to feel a little better. You see again here two kinds of noun phrase, the pronoun and the proper name. And the last one, he said that Bertie felt a little better. Again, you see here two kinds of NP or noun phrases. So in this example, as I told you, there are three types of NPs. Okay, the first one, full noun phrases, for example like Poirot, Bertie, and etc. The second one, pronouns such as he or him. Okay, and the third one, reflexive elements, for example like himself. So you see three types of NPs in these sentences, as I told you. The examples above already illustrated that the interpretation of NPs is at least partly constrained by grammatical principles. For example, in the case of pronoun, as in 1a, the grammar delimits the interpretation of the pronoun him in that whatever the context, the pronoun him cannot be co-referential with the subject Poirot. You look at the example number 1a, Poirot admires him. As you see here, this pronoun cannot refer back to the Poirot. You see here, it's another person because Poirot admires him. Him in this sentence means another person other than Poirot. So in each sentence you see the NPs has its special interpretation. In the case of, for example, the reflexive like himself, for example in 1b, the grammar determines that the reflexive must be dependent on the subject Bertie. You see example number B, 1b, Bertie hurt himself. This is a kind of this is a reflexive pronoun, and reflexive pronoun should be referred to the subject. It means that the himself here is Bertie himself, so it refers back to the subject. Okay, this is the interpretation of, for example, reflexive. In 1c, example 1c, the grammar allowed interpretation where he and Bertie are co-referential. You see again example 1c, Bertie said that he felt rather ill. You see here, this is a kind of sentence which allow to, the pronoun he comes back to the Bertie, the subject, and there is no problem. And again, in 1F, this interpretation is blocked. It means that in the sentence 1F, he said that Bertil felt a little better. This he cannot comes back to the Bertie. So as you see here, each sentence has its special interpretation, and each pronoun in each sentence can have its special interpretation depending on the sentence. So in this chapter we introduce the grammatical principles which determines the interpretation of NPs. As I told you, the module of the grammar that regulates the referential properties of NPs is called binding theory. You see, the binding theory provides an explicit formulation of the grammatical constraints on NP. The binding theory essentially examines the relations between NPs in A position. It is a theory of A binding. We call it A binding. So what is the binding theory? Okay, it consists of three principles. You see here, first, principle A. Principle A imposes that reflexives like himself, for example, are linked to or bound by an NP in an A position within a certain domain, the binding domain. You see here the example here, number B, Bertie hurt himself. This is a kind of reflexive pronoun. It should refer to the subject. So this is principle number A of the binding theory. Principle B constrains the interpretation of pronouns like he or him. Pronouns should not be linked to an NP in an A position within the binding domain. Look at this example again. Number 1, Poirot admires him. Him is a kind of pronoun. In this sentence, him cannot refers back to the subject. Okay, so it has a kind of another reference. But in 1B, as I told you, according to principle A, himself as a reflexive pronoun should comes back to the subject. But here, this pronoun cannot comes back to the subject. So this is principle number B. And principle C, finally, is the principle which determines the distribution and interpretation of referential expressions like the NP Poirot. So principle number C, it's about the proper name or noun like Poirot. Principle C says that referential expressions like these proper names must not be bound by NPs in A position. For example, look at the examples again. For example, this example, he said that Bertie felt a little better. This is a kind of referential expression or proper name. This proper name cannot comes back to the subject, pronoun. So it is free in its domain. So it not can comes back to the some reference. It doesn't have a reference. It is free in this sentence. This is principle C of the binding theory. So as I told you, the binding theory consists of three principles. Principle A, which talks about the reflexive pronouns, principle B, which talks about the pronouns, and principle C, which talks about the referential expression or proper names. So first, the reflexive, principle A. We want to talk about the reflexive, the principle A of binding theory. Binding and antecedent. Look at these examples. Poirot hurt himself, you see, and Miss Marple hurt himself. This is ungrammatical. Why? The reflexive, like here, himself, and its antecedent must agree with respect to the nominal features like person, gender, and number. For example, in the first example, himself is a kind of, masculine pronoun, so it comes back to the Poirot as a masculine noun, you see here. But in the second, Miss Marple is a kind of feminine noun, so himself as a masculine noun cannot as a masculine, I mean reflexive pronoun cannot comes back to the Miss Marple as a feminine, okay, noun. So this is ungrammatical. You see this asterisk? So the first one is correct and the second one is ungrammatical because of the, I mean, mismatching between the gender. You see here? So because reflexives lack independent reference, they must have an antecedent. We call it antecedent, like Poirot here. It's the antecedent of the himself. Pronouns may also function as antecedent for reflexives, as in this example, he is the antecedent of reflexive. So not only the proper names can be the antecedent of the reflexive, but also the, I mean, pronouns can be the antecedent of reflexive. Look at this example. He has hurt himself. You see here, this himself as a reflexive can comes back to the pronoun he here. So the pronoun can be the antecedent of reflexive. So this is the antecedent, okay? There is another kind of constraint or condition. We call it locality constraint. What is locality constraint? Look at these examples again. Poirot hurt himself. You see here, himself as a reflexive pronoun can comes back to the Poirot as its antecedent, and it's okay. There is a matching between, I mean, the person and the gender, and there is no problem. But look at sentence number 2. Poirot thinks that Miss Marple hurt himself. You see here, there is a kind of, I mean, distance between the antecedent Poirot and himself here. So we doesn't have locality condition here, because between these two, I mean, NPs, there is another NP, Miss Marple. Himself cannot comes back to Miss Marple. Why? Because Miss Marple is a feminine noun and himself is a kind of masculine noun. So himself should comes back to the Poirot in the first part of the sentence. But if it comes back to the Poirot, I mean, there is no locality constraint. So we can say that this sentence is ungrammatical because of the locality constraint. And look at number 3, example number 3. Miss Marple thinks that Poirot has hurt himself, and this is okay because himself as a masculine reflexive pronoun can comes back to the Poirot as the, I mean, the masculine reference, and there is antecedent and there is no problem. So this is the locality constraint. So the reflexive must be locally bound, okay? From the example number 6, we might provisionally conclude that reflexive and antecedent must be in the same clause. You see here, the reflexive and the antecedent should be in the same clause, okay? Again, look at these examples. I expect himself to invite Poirot. This is ungrammatical because the antecedent should be, I mean, the place of antecedent should be before the reflexive, not after it. So this is ungrammatical. Look at the second one. Poirot invited himself. It's okay because himself comes, I mean, after the Poirot, and it is the antecedent, and there is no problem. But the third one, again, Poirot's sister invited himself. Himself should comes back to the Poirot, but Poirot here in Poirot's sister is the place of it in the spec position of the subject, I mean NP, and it cannot be the antecedent of himself. If we, I mean, consider sister as the antecedent of himself, there is a kind of mismatch between the gender. This is sister and this is himself, so it is ungrammatical. So again, I want to say that reflexive and antecedent must be in the same clause. You see here, this is the locality constraint. Okay, structural relations between antecedent and reflexive. So you look at this these 3 diagrams, 8. These 3 diagrams gives, I mean the tree diagram representation for the example in 7. I mean these three ones. I mean, I expect himself to invite Poirot. Poirot invited himself, and Poirot's sister invited himself. So look at the tree diagram. For each of the examples above, circle the reflexive and the antecedent in preparation of the discussion. You look at this example, himself to invite Poirot. You see here, himself is before the, antecedent Poirot. So this is ungrammatical, as I told you. And another example, Poirot invited himself. This is okay because Poirot is before himself and can be the antecedent of himself, and himself as a reflexive can comes back to this antecedent, and this is okay. So this is ungrammatical, but this is grammatical and there is no problem. To another examples, Poirot's sister invited himself. You look at this example, himself can comes back to the Poirot, but Poirot is before the sister in the spec NP, so cannot be the antecedent of himself, and sister as the the nearest antecedent cannot be the the antecedent of the himself, because there is a mismatch between the gender between the sister and the himself. So this is an ungrammatical sentence. But look at another example. Poirot's brother invited himself. You see here, himself can comes back to the brother because brother is the nearest antecedent of the himself, and it is masculine in gender. So this is a matching between the gender between himself and brother, and it can be the antecedent of the himself, and this is okay. So a careful comparison of structural relations between antecedent and reflexive in the sentences above leads us to the conclusion that the relation is one that we have described as C-command. The antecedent must C-command the reflexive. You see here, the antecedent, like the Poirot, should C-command the himself. So this is the condition for binding, the C-command. Again, before in the previous sessions, I talked about the C-command. Again, I told you about the C-command here. A node A C-commands a node B if and only if A does not dominate B, B does not dominate A, and the first branching node dominating A also dominates B. This is the C-command condition, which I talked about it before. The reader can verify for himself that in all of the grammatical examples in 8, in these 3 diagrams as I told you, the relevant relation holds. Let us now try to formulate the constraints and the interpretation of reflexive. So the binding theory, the principle A of binding theory is that principle of reflexive interpretation. A reflexive must be bound by a classmate antecedent. This is the locality constraint. So a reflexive must be bound by a classmate antecedent. Binding is defined in terms of C-command. By what is binding? A binds B if and only if A C-commands B. A and B are co-index. They share the index, the same index. So this is the condition of binding. The domain, what is the domain of reflexive binding? Okay, the domain. First, governors. Look at these examples again. Poirot believes himself to be the best. Poirot believes that himself is the best. And Poirot believes Miss Marple's description of himself. You see here, the first one is correct because himself here as a reflexive can comes back to the Poirot, and this is okay. The second one, Poirot believes that himself is the best. You see here, this is another CP, another sentence which starts with the that complementizer. So himself cannot comes back to the Poirot in the first place of the sentence because there is no locality constraint here. Himself is in another sentence and Poirot is in another sentence. So this is ungrammatical. The third one, Poirot believes Miss Marple's description of himself. Miss Marple is the nearest antecedent of himself, but there is a kind of mismatch between the himself and Miss Marple according to the gender feature. It's feminine and it is masculine, and himself cannot come back to the Poirot because they are in different sentences and there is no locality constraint here. So this is ungrammatical again. Just the first one is grammatical because himself can come back to the Poirot, and that's okay, there is no problem. So again, we can revise the principle of reflexive interpretation. Again, a reflexive X must be bound inside a clause that contains X and X's governor. This is the antecedent or the governor of the reflexive. We call it antecedent or governor of the reflexive, himself here. So the reformulation extends the local domain in which we find an antecedent for a reflexive in those cases in which the reflexive is governed from a higher clause. You see here, this is okay in these sentences. So we have a condition by these definitions which I told you. We have complete functional complex. Okay, we call it complete functional complex. Again, we revise the principle of reflexive interpretation. A reflexive X must be bound in the minimal domain containing X, the reflexive, X as governor, the antecedent, and a kind of subject. Okay, look at these examples. If I ask you about the ungrammaticality of this sentence, I expect himself to invite Poirot, you should say that here himself as a reflexive is before the Poirot as the antecedent. So this is ungrammatical because the reflexive should be after the antecedent. So this is ungrammatical. The second one, Poirot invited himself. This is the correct sentence. There is no problem. Himself can come back to the Poirot, and this is okay. The third one, Miss Marple heard himself. There is a kind of mismatch between himself and Miss Marple. This is feminine noun and this is masculine pronoun. So it cannot come back to the feminine noun. This is ungrammatical. The other one, he has heard himself. This is okay because himself can comes back to the pronoun he, and this is the antecedent of himself, and this is okay. The other one, Poirot thinks that Miss Marple heard himself. Himself cannot comes back to the Miss Marple in its sentence because Miss Marple is feminine and himself is masculine. And if we say that himself comes back to the Poirot in the above sentence, the locality constraint, there is no the locality constraint, so this is ungrammatical sentence. The other one, Poirot's sister invited himself. Again, this is ungrammatical because Poirot's sister, Poirot cannot be the the antecedent of himself because sister is nearest antecedent of himself, but there is mismatch between the gender of these two noun NPs. So this is again ungrammatical. Poirot here is in the spec of NP, so cannot be the antecedent of himself. The other one, Poirot's brother invited himself. This is okay because himself can comes back to the brother, and there is matching between the gender of these two NPs. They are both masculine, so brother can be the antecedent of himself, and this is okay. And the other one, Poirot believes himself to be the best. Again, this is okay because himself can comes back to the Poirot as its antecedent, and this sentence is correct. The other one, Poirot believes that himself is the best. Again, here himself cannot comes back to the Poirot because this is another sentence, that himself, and himself cannot comes back to the antecedent in the above sentence. Again, there is no locality condition here, so this is ungrammatical. The other one, Poirot believes Miss Marple's description of himself. Again, himself cannot comes back to the Miss Marple because this is feminine and this is masculine, and also it cannot comes back to the Poirot in the above sentence because of the locality constraint. So this is again ungrammatical. The other one, Poirot believes any description of himself can comes back to the Poirot in the first place of the sentence, and this is okay, there is no problem, and this is correct sentence. And the last one, Miss Marple believes Poirot's description of himself. You see here, Poirot can comes back to the himself can comes back to the Poirot, and this is the antecedent of himself, and there is locality condition, and there is, no problem, and this is the correct sentence. You see here, this is the explanation of the reflexive pronouns. In order to determine the binding domain for the reflexive, you should proceed as follows. First, find the governor, the antecedent of the reflexive, like for example this example, Poirot is the antecedent or governor of himself. Second, find the closest subject. Again, look at this is the subject, the closest subject of the the reflexive, and the smallest IP or NP containing these two elements will be the binding domain in which the reflexive must be bound, or it means co-index with a seconding antecedent. You see here, this is the domain. For example, this NP is the domain of the binding of the reflexive himself. So this is the explanation of the reflexive pronoun. I think that's enough for today. So in this session I talk about the binding theory, and the first principle, it consists of three principles, principle A, B, and C. But in this session just I talked about the principle A, the reflexive principle. So that's enough for today. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye everybody.